Right?
A very warm welcome, Ken. A very good morning. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to have you here today amidst us. I was looking at your biography that you had sent me very kindly, and it's impressive to see that your ninth novel just got released. So congratulations on
Thank you.
that. I hope it does really well.
You and me both.
How have the first rushes been? How has the first response been in the last week or so?
Very, very positive. Right? I have heard from quite a few early readers of the book. In other words,
Mhm.
people who picked it up within the first week or two, and now have had a chance to actually finish it and get back to me. And so far, the response is very, very positive. So now we enter into the marketing and awareness phase.
Exactly, and that tends to be the one that is the bane for many authors. They're not sure how this all dynamics of the market work, and it gets interesting.
Yep.
So,
As an author, we just want to throw it out there and say, here's my work. Everybody come read, right? And I'm going to move on to the next one. But you're right. That's not how it works in the real world.
right, and this is a traditional publisher, or how have you gone about it?
No, I went with an independent publisher on this one just due to the time constraints that I had, which I know we're
Right.
going to talk about this book specifically later. So I'll kind of lay that out.
Sure. I think amongst all the authors I've interviewed and spoken to, you're the only one perhaps who writes for adult fiction, teenager fiction, and middle grade school fiction, and it's very impressive at the same time intimidating to see that someone possesses that level of talent.
Well, others may call it just a lack of focus. So I guess, pick the term which fits best.
I also added another account of ours, Story Zone. This is the team with which we host the book club. Story Zone is a Bangalore-based community where we get together and collaborate on different projects involving art, involving different types of craft, books, theater, and much more. So our book club sort of runs in collaboration with Story Zone, and we've just added that account so that it reaches more people and we get more of an audience outreach.
Okay. The more the merrier.
Yes, absolutely. So I think let me just quickly, for the sake of people who have joined in now, just welcome you again, Ken, to the Story Zone Book Club Fireside Chat event this evening. For the audience, Ken is joining us from Wisconsin, and he is a nine-time novelist. And his ninth book, The Breakfast Jury, just released last week. Before that, he has written a series for middle grade students, and the series was called The Hunts of Raimy Rylan. Did I pronounce that
You
correctly?
did pronounce it correctly. Yes.
And then a couple of books for his kids, which are more in the teenage zombie apocalypse genre. One was called The Ghoul, and the other one was called Ghouls and Boys. And he's also done a trilogy of adult fiction books called The Killing Arc. And now his new book which is, I think, a mystery whodunit kind of a plot. And he's here to talk us about his journey, his books, and more. So welcome, Ken, once again.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's get this started, Ken, with probably an introduction of sorts, a personal introduction of sorts from you, where you help us understand how books entered your life and what was the first book that you fell in love with, and how it all conspired to get you to become a writer.
Right. So I grew up in Minnesota in the U.S., which is right next door to Wisconsin, and it was really just a pretty normal childhood. Right, two parent household. They worked, and I spent a lot of time, in my room reading, writing, and drawing. Those really were my hobbies growing up. Right. Obviously, I would get into physical things like riding bikes and playing sports, but
Mhm.
most often I would be focusing on some level of creative action, right? Writing. I
Sure.
used to draw comic book characters all the time as a kid, like just with marker on notebook paper, draw an Iron Man or a Hulk or a Thor character, and then tape them to my wall. And so, you know, reading books growing up just kind of fell into that same creative groove. I read a lot and predominantly fantasy and science fiction books, like many young kids, right? I was into the
Right.
fantasy and science fiction aspect. So that's what I really grew up reading. And those are some of my major hobbies. And if you were to ask me, okay, then what's your favorite book, for instance, or what are some of your favorite books? I will never answer what my one favorite book is, just like I will never answer what my one favorite song is. It's more like, here are the books from authors that really struck a chord with me. Just like, here's my favorite song from this group, and
Hmm.
here's my favorite song from a different group. So when I was young, in reading the fantasy science fiction, there are really three series that just stick with me to this day. One was the Sword of Shannara series by Terry Brooks, which is kind of a light version, a bit of a ripoff from the Lord of the Rings, right? It had a lot of the similar elements, but
Sure.
just the way it was told really stuck with me more than Lord of the Rings did.
Sure.
Then there was the Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, right? And those are probably those two are probably the earliest ones I really remember and sticking with me, right? For whatever reason, being taken to these different worlds and being dropped in to live the point of view character of those worlds, really, really made an impact on my young self. And then the third series I would include came when I was a little bit older, probably in, the middle grade or junior high era, and that was the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. There was the initial trilogy on that, which was followed by a sequel trilogy, and those also were much different writing, much different tone and themes than the Shannara or the Pern series, but just as equally impactful. Maybe because I was older when I read them, it made impact. It wouldn't have lasted when I was young because they were very dense books. And so, as a young kid, those really are kind of what propelled me into writing. Because then I would start writing, short stories that kind of, riffed on some of the themes from those books, right? Like, the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, he had a ring, a white gold ring that was a talisman of power. Whereas in my book, I'm like, all right, we'll give him a watch. I'm going to give my main character a watch, but it does a lot of the same things. And so I would just sit and write stories kind of based on that, what we today call fan fiction,
Right.
but just writing stories using some of those characters or some of the themes
Right.
from their
Right.
stories. Um, as an adult, Nelson DeMille, who's a very prolific author, writes a lot of the murder thriller, mystery thriller genre. A lot of his early works really stuck with me. For instance, like The Gold Coast or Spencerville are two novels. General's Daughter and Plum Island are two others. And there were probably two primary reasons that those really had an impact on me. Is one, he writes in my native style of writing is very similar to the way he writes. Very
Hmm.
fast paced, kind of wisecracking characters who, don't listen to anybody and can often be wrong, right? So he just, he had characters or had a writing style that was similar to mine. And the other thing that really struck me, especially in the Gold Coast and Spencerville, was even though these were your typical murder thriller, there
Hmm.
was a lot of social commentary as the
Hmm.
backdrop. Like the Gold Coast novel, for instance, really just laments the whole decay of the Gold Coast in New York, USA, which is where, the Great Gatsby, the golden era started,
Yeah.
right? All the wealth on that, on Long Island there. It's called the Gold Coast. And he spent the first half of that book really talking about how it's a dying way of life. And so I was
Ah.
very struck by his ability to kind of put those two types of writing into one book and make it work. And so I've always been a fan of Nelson DeMille and his writing style. And the one other book I'm going to mention as an adult, which really struck with me, is from an author called Nicholas Eames. I think it's his last name, Eames. He wrote a sword and sorcery fantasy book called Kings of the Wild, which I didn't read till probably, I read it, I think I came across it 10 years ago, roughly right after
Okay.
it came out. And it was a fresh take on the whole fantasy sword buckling adventure, but it's the take and the type of book I wish I would have written. I'm like, it was just, I'm like, this, just was a thunderstrike book to me in terms of how he took a lot of the standard fantasy tropes that we know and, turned them a bit on their ear and just made an incredibly compelling book. And so that's another one that it stuck with me, even though it was just a chance encounter. And so those were a lot of my influences. And I will say that it probably has actually hampered my enjoyment as a reader now. I'm less of a consumer when I read books and more of a critic. And that's a terrible thing because it's so easy to put a book down because that author made choices that I would not have made. Right? It's got to be a book like Kings of the Wild that just, sets me back on my rear to keep me engaged. But nowadays, there are too many books where I start reading, and our house is littered with books that have a bookmark sticking out halfway through because that's all the further I got. And then I'm like, nope, I can't do this anymore. So books aren't as big a role in my life reading as they should be and used to be, unfortunately.
Interesting.
Yep.
Very interesting. You mentioned something very interesting about this book that you were talking about, that probably slightly unexpected in the way it dealt with familiar subjects and slightly irreverential to the traditional patterns of writing in that genre. So is that reflective of Ken as a person as well? And the slightly rebellious streak, maybe?
Yeah. Yes. If you were to ask people who grew up close to me or my wife now, I do have a problem with authority. I do have a problem with kind of being told what to do, for better or for
Okay.
worse. And so that is something that tends to come through in a number of my characters, that they kind of take my, I don't want to say rebellious, but my independent line of thought, but they carry it to extremes and they think they're right no matter what. My wife may actually say the same thing, but that does come through in a number of my characters where they have this self-conviction that may or may not be right. I
Okay.
try to convey that.
Very interesting. But they do say, right, that art imitates life, and sometimes art imitates the life of the artist the most. So
Yep.
yeah,
You
I
write what you
mean,
know. Right. I write what I know, and too often I do find that my characters react in a way I would react. And so,
interesting.
it does become a conscious decision to say, wait, if my initial response to that as a person is no, what happens if my character says yes instead? Right? Where does that lead us?
Mhm,
And so it is.
mhm.
Sometimes you have to be careful not to let too much of yourself bleed into your work.
However, right, some of the subjects that you have selected, especially the zombie apocalypse books that you've written, and one for your daughter and one for your son, and you say that there is a third one in the offing, which is, I think, for the youngest one.
Yep.
I am very intrigued by the choice of the subject as a parent that you had when presenting these books to your kids.
So, if I can, let me take you back to the start of the writing because that also was triggered, by a child of mine. And it
Okay.
was during a fourth grade teacher conference. So my middle child, Cameron, was in fourth grade at the time. So he's 10 or 11. And the teacher was saying, Cameron is a really good reader, but he doesn't read a lot because there's not a lot of good books out there for boys, for 10-year-old
Okay.
boys, which
Okay.
I didn't know. I guess I'd never thought about that. And I remember thinking during the conference, really? Is that true? Is there not a lot of good books? And at that moment, and by the end of the conference, I had fleshed out a book in my head, like the concept of a plot in my head for a book that would really kind of be geared towards, young male readers. In other words, there's a lot more, it's not about relationships, it's about action, right? And fighting demons and, all that stuff that I thought would be of more interest to young male readers. And that became the first book in the Raimy Rylan series.
Oh, okay. Very
So,
interesting.
yep, I wrote that. I went back to his class later in the year, or maybe the next year, and actually, talked to the class about the importance of reading, gave everybody a signed copy, and just kind of really spoke from an author's standpoint, what reading means. And I did that for a couple of years for a few schools in the area. So then, and so that ended up being a trilogy that I wrote over the course of the next few years. Well, then that brings me to my oldest child. Kaylee is her name, and she's graduating high school. And I'm thinking, okay, what do we get her for a graduation present? Right? We've already bought her a car. We've taken her on vacations. I want to give her something that nobody else has. And at that time, she and her closest group of friends were all into the Walking Dead show. So the whole world of the zombie apocalypse, they would have watch parties, they would talk about it. And so I decided, oh, I'm going to give her a book then. I'm going to give her something that nobody else has. And it's a book that stars her and her closest friends in this zombie apocalypse world. 25 years after the zombies have won is when this is set. And my daughter and her friends are essentially set out on a mission. So it reads a bit like a fantasy book, right? They have a quest to save the world, but it stars her and her friends, right? And they are the main group in it. And so when she graduated, then, I gave her and all her friends a signed copy and,
Wow.
gave copies to the parents and said, here's my gift to you guys. Um, I did only give myself about 6 months to write that book. And I think it was a 70,000 word book.
Oh
So
my
that part
God.
I would
Wow.
recommend plan a little better. Don't wait till I wish I would have thought of that a year ahead of time, but I didn't. So that was a very much a forced march to crank that book out in 6 months. And so that was a book named Ghoul, right? Instead of zombies, are called ghouls in that world.
Okay.
And then 4 years later, Cameron, the kid who kicked it all off originally, well, he's graduating. He's coming up for
Okay.
graduation in 2022. I'm like, I think I'm just going to do a sequel to Ghoul. It's all the same setting. It's the same world. My sister or my daughter and some of her friends appear in the book, but now it's all focused on my son and his closest friends, and a continuation of that story arc that I had laid out in book one. And then, as you referenced, yes, I have a third child yet that is 2 years away from
Okay.
graduating. So
Okay.
I got to get a book for him, and I have plenty of time now to think about it and plan it. I'm not going to wait till the last second.
Yes, but this is such a, I mean, I think a brilliant and unique gesture. I'm sure your kids would have loved the surprise.
Yep. My daughter's a reader, and she reads
Okay.
quite a few books. I think she's probably the only one that has read those books so far. From like her friends did, but I don't think very many. I know my sons didn't
Okay.
read these, and I don't think very many of his friends did either. So maybe I still haven't landed on the real formula for keeping young male readers engaged. But dadgummit, I'm trying.
Yes, I mean, I don't think anyone can fault you for that.
That's right. Got to give it a shot. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is unlike anything I've ever heard before. I mean, the journey or the trigger for you to become a writer, and how fast you were able to come up with the concept of what you wanted to write in your first book. Um, how did you decide, however, that this book is going to be a trilogy, or did it happen later on?
It did actually happen later on. Right? I
Okay.
didn't in in both cases of the trilogies I've written, I didn't come into it thinking, all right, I've got to create a story arc that lasts 3 books. They were sincerely, they started off as one-off efforts. Right. The
Uh-huh.
first one, just I'm gonna write a book for my son and his male friends to read. Right. And that's all I had started with. Right. So at the end of it, I realized, wow, I can continue this type of story arc. I can continue using this world and this concept for other books. And that one is easier because it's a little more open and ended. Each book is just a slightly separate adventure
Got it.
starring the 3 main characters. So, I didn't need to do a lot of, story arc layouts to continue on. I just had to move on to the next adventure.
Right.
Whereas with the adult thriller series, Killing the Ark is the name of the trilogy. The first book is called Killing the Man. And I had written that manuscript probably in my 20s and
Hmm.
just, threw it down in a drawer somewhere and never did anything with it. And so after I'd written the first, young book for my son, I thought, what do I want to do next? Oh, I'm going to dust off that Killing the Man manuscript because I always liked it, right? I thought it was a fun book to read. I enjoyed writing it. I said, I'm going to dust that off. I'm going to make that my second book out there. And so that is what happened. And that is a book where, people who have read it and know me said, this sounds exactly like you, like the internal dialogue, the things that you say, the things that you do. That's one where there's probably too much of me in the main character. there, um, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Um, and that was one too, where I said, okay, if this continues on, how do I make this a story arc? And it
Mhm.
really ended up moving on to a completely different main character. You know, for the book one and book two were connected by some of the background
Mhm.
links or background
Mhm.
characters, but it really shifted to a new main character who looped in the previous main character at the end,
Sure.
right? To kind of pull the circle tight. And so the second one is called The Killing Face, and then the final book in that trilogy, which stays with the main character of the second book, the final one is titled Arch Enemy. And so
Mhm.
that really closed out that trilogy, that theme, that topic. You know, I don't have anything more to say on that.
Sure.
Although this will come in later when we talk about my breakfast jury. At the end of Arch Enemy, my wife read it. She looked at me and she's like, "Wait, what happened to the main character?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, you just left it here." She's like, "Well, that's crap." She was in no uncertain terms happy about the way I left it off with the main character. So sometimes you take your criticism where it comes and you just say, "Sorry, honey, I'll fix dinner."
Uh, very interesting that you mentioned that. I was going to ask anyways, like how's the reaction of your family?
Yeah.
You said that your daughter has read the book, but your wife seems to be the one who's giving you probably the most feedback.
Yep. Yep. My wife will not pull any punches. She'll tell me what she likes and what she doesn't understand. Um, whereas, a lot of times when you ask friends or people you know to critique your work, there's this natural inclination to say, well, I don't want to say anything that might hurt their feelings, right? Or
Right.
I don't know how to say that. So I'll just say I liked it, which as an author is probably the least helpful feedback you can get
Yeah.
because there is no one book that everybody universally likes. Everybody can
Right.
pick apart a book and find things they like or they don't like.
Mhm.
And as an author, what we need to hear are things that you don't like and then why, right? It's one thing not to like the way a character acts if I chose that character to act that way. But it's another thing to say, I don't understand what's going on, right? Or this plot doesn't make sense to me. How did this
Sure.
happen? How did that happen?
Yeah.
Those are the types of things that I think really help move authors along, is looking for
Right.
the flaws as opposed to the differences.
Absolutely. In the journey that you take in terms of developing a plot or a story outline, do you decide or you get hooked onto an idea or a certain story plot or a hook, or do you think more of the characters first and then flesh the story around them, or does it happen more harmoniously, like together for you?
Um, I'm going to say it's probably the plot that comes first. And quite often, it'll come from something I've read. I'll read an article, for instance, and it
Mhm.
just sparks an idea for me. Like, what can I say? Recently, I read an article that in 2012, down in the state of
Right.
Louisiana in the USA, a massive sinkhole developed and essentially, took over the entire town to the point that
Hmm.
today there's only, less than 50 people living in that town. Well, all right, so that's some sort of natural event that wouldn't be that big of a deal. But in 2012 is also when the Mayan calendar had predicted that the world would end. And if you remember that, right? There was
Yes.
a lot of talk.
Yes, I do.
2012 is, there's even a movie about 2012.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
well, I thought, what if, right? What if people living in this town in 2012 think this sinkhole is the end of the world happening?
The end of
Right?
the
Like it's
world.
a first sign for them. And so I kind of, strung together those two ideas. And so that becomes the germ of a book, right? I kind of
Uh-huh.
file that away. But, if and when I pursue that idea, that's when I then create the characters. I kind of develop what
Great.
type of character do I want to have in this, right? What type of characters will react the best and the worst to this event?
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Sure.
yeah, I would say it's most certainly the plot, then the characters.
Great. Very interesting. Yeah, I was speaking to another author just last week, and I mean, his answer was exactly the opposite. So for him, he forms the characters in his mind, and then he tries to figure out their journey. And what intrigues me here, and the reason I mention it here is, I think every single author I have interviewed or met with, there is a very unique, different, interesting, creative process, and it looks like. Uh, Yeah, I mean, I think just like any form of art, it's quite subjective.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it is.
You know, we I know a lot of authors that will say they write when when the muse strikes them. Like they're not, they don't necessarily write on a schedule. They may be thinking about something in their book or something to write,
Mhm.
and then when the mood hits, they write it all down. And I am not that way at all. When I'm writing a book, I am very, very regimented and scheduled, right? I want to start writing by 7 a.m. I generally can write for about 3 hours before I start losing focus. And so, I treat it very much like a job. Okay, up till morning break is when I write. After morning break, I may go back and do some editing. I may explore some different story ideas. I may do research on something that's coming up in the book. But I tend to be very, very kind of regimented and organized in how I write. And that to me, that's just critical to my process. But there are a lot of authors
Yes.
that are like, oh, I can't do that. I could not do that at all. So when you say subjective, absolutely, that is just that's the name of the game when you're doing creativity.
Are you a full-time author or a writer, or is there another uh, hustle somewhere that you're a part of, another job that you're probably
So
doing?
I retired from the corporate workforce in June of last year,
Okay.
and with the idea that I wouldn't say full-time writer. I would say, a writer that may be full-time for 1 year and then may only be part-time for the next year. It kind of depends on the projects. I do have a side hustle. I'm the director of operations for the Wisconsin Writing Association, which just celebrated its 75th anniversary last year, and I think is one of the oldest
Yay.
writing groups in the Midwest America. So, I handle a lot of their technical infrastructure, all their back end, anything related to the technology that they use is my role with them, right? That's just a part-time gig, but it's something that keeps me engaged in the writing community. And then other than
Great.
that, it's things like working on cars, working on home renovation, just being active. Yeah.
Great. I remember reading in your biography that there is a podcast that you host and manage there where you sort of talk about the publishing process, the creative writing process, and the journeys of different authors. So tell us a little bit about how that works and motivation behind building a platform like that.
Absolutely. So the podcast idea is one that the Wisconsin Writers Association, we just call it WWA for short, had been talking about for about a year or so before I came on board as a director of operations. Because their mission really is to help, writers, Midwest-based writers, develop their craft, get better at writing, get help with publishing, just kind of, live their writerly life. That's the
Right.
WWA's mission. And so we thought a podcast would be a supplement to that. And what that podcast does is it really focuses on the types of writing that comes out of the Midwest. Right? When you read writers that grew up or set their stories in Midwest America, you get a lot
Right.
of references to nature, to the rhythm of the
Mm.
seasons, to the crops and the animals that just come into play, and the lifestyle that accompanies that.
Right.
The 5 a.m. wake up call because you got to milk cows before you go to school, or walking down a cornfield in late July and just hearing the buzz as the
Right.
corn grows. Right? These are things that authors in the Midwest tend to write about, and writers or readers in the Midwest tend to recognize. It's like, oh yes,
Sure.
right, kind of that very connection. So we launched the podcast. It is called the Midwest Writers Room. There's myself and my co-host Luella Schmidt, and we put out 6 episodes at the end of 2023 last year, where we interviewed 6 different authors who came from the WWA. In 2024, we're essentially scheduled and booked out already through June
Wow.
to our summer hiatus, and we will interview authors, but we're also going to expand it and have episodes that focus on, honing your craft. So if there are
Sure.
workshops coming up in the area or programs that help writers write more, we'll interview the people that run those programs. We'll do interviews with people from the industry. So we just did the most recent podcast that'll be out in the next couple of weeks is with a manager from Ingram Spark, which is a book
Okay.
distribution,
Yes.
the largest book distribution network. And so it's really talking to her about what does Ingram Spark really do for the writer, right? How do you assist their publishing career, and where do you see the publishing industry going in the next few years? So we've essentially got three types of episodes that we put out: the author, the craft, and the industry episode. And that we release on pretty much a bi-weekly schedule through the rest of
Great.
2024. Yeah, it's been good, and we meant to keep the podcast very conversational. Like, our template is very streamlined. It just says, ask about this question, open conversation, right? Because we
Hmm.
want to be able to follow any question threads that pop up, right?
Right.
If we want to go down a
Right.
rabbit hole about something specific, we want to leave ourselves space to do that. So that's what that
Yes.
podcast is all about.
So, Ken, let's talk about the book that's hot off the press and
Yep.
the Breakfast Jury. First of all, I mean, I was trying to reconcile the name. I was trying to understand what does it mean, and so I would really like to know about the book and the title
Yep.
and what is it about. I mean, I know it's based on some real life events, but I don't want to disclose that. I'd like you to perhaps take us through that a
Sure.
little bit.
So in January of last year, 2023, I was selected to serve on the jury of a murder trial.
Hmm.
And the defendant, a husband, was accused of murdering his wife by feeding her antifreeze. So the
Oh,
antifreeze that you put in your car, and this was
wow.
back in 1998 that he did that. He was accused of feeding her antifreeze, which then caused her death. And he had been convicted once back in the later 2000s, but there was some legal technicality ruling where our Supreme Court said, well, this shouldn't have been allowed as evidence. So they vacated his guilty verdict, and it came back around. So that was the jury that I served on, essentially the second time
Okay.
he was being put on trial for that. And the first time this happened, it was the longest trial in Wisconsin state history. It lasted 7 weeks and had
Wow.
nearly 100 different witnesses who testified. In our case, it lasted about 4 weeks, and we had a lot of those same witnesses. And so that's a very long trial. I
Right.
figured, all right, I'll go in and it'll be for a theft case or somebody who's caught driving under the influence, last a day or two, and then we'll be out. No, it was a month that 16 of us were together every day, all day, put in a jury room, walked to the courtroom, walked back to the jury room. And I found it to be a very interesting event in my life because you get to know these people. You get to know them well, but you don't really know anything about them. In
Mm.
other words, you don't
Yeah.
know what their families like, what their kids like, but you know what they like to eat, their habits, the way they think, the way they talk. You kind of develop this bond that only exists really within that jury room.
Right.
And so that's what sparked the idea for me. And, for listeners who are not from America, there probably needs to be a little explanation on the background and the title of the book, The Breakfast Jury. In the mid
Sure.
80s, there was this movie that came out called The Breakfast Club. And it
Yes.
was about, right, five teenagers who had nothing in common, but they were locked in a library all day on a Saturday for detention. And they came out finding out that, wow, they're not so different after all. A lot of their experiences were all the same. And so I kind of translated that into our experience. I'm like, we're like the Breakfast Club, only times three, because there's 16 of us. But a lot of the things that we were going through, the way we're getting to know each other, just kind of echoed what happened in that Breakfast Club movie.
Hmm.
And so on the last day of our that we were together as a jury, after we delivered the verdict, because they ended up electing me as foreman, so I did deliver the verdict in this
Okay.
case. I told them all, I said, in 1 year we're gonna get together, and I'm gonna have a book for you guys, right? Because they all knew I was an author because we had talked about it, and they kept saying, "Well, you need to write a book. You need to write a book." But I spent most of the time trying to think what type of book it would be. I didn't want to write your usual tell-all, right? This is
Right.
what happened during the trial, because frankly, you know, jury service is pretty boring. You show up, you listen, you sit down, you listen some more, and you go home, right? There wasn't enough in it to be compelling to me, and it's not the type of book I write. Well, what I ended up doing was creating a story that's told in two different layers. And one layer is the experience of the jury, the experience of us. going
Right.
through this, and the majority of things that happened along that storyline were true. Like
Sure.
the things that were said, the things that were done, the witness evidence, that was all based on our experience. Well, the other layer of the book occurs 1 year later when the jury gets together to reunite, and then they are poisoned by something that seems suspiciously like antifreeze. And so that second layer is the story of the detective who's been charged to find out what happened. And surprise, surprise, that detective is the detective from my Killing Arc series, for which my
Ah,
wife, in no uncertain terms, declared his story is not over. So I reused him
okay.
as a character and dropped him in. And
Oh
so
my
that's
God.
how
That
it
is
comes full circle.
yes, and I'm sure that made your wife happy that you actually listened to her and acted upon it.
Happy wife, happy life. Yep, she was much more satisfied now that his story arc kind of got some more attention on
Uh-huh,
it.
uh-huh.
And so, yep. And so that book came out a couple weeks ago and is now available
Yeah.
through Amazon.
Has any one of your jury co-members read the book and have they talked to you about it? Have they expressed their feedback?
Yes. So, in the book, a key event is the fact that the entire jury regrouped 1 year later to kind of
Right.
celebrate their verdict. Well, last weekend, our jury all regrouped, got back together on the one
Oh
year
wow,
anniversary, and I
that's
gave
great.
them all a signed copy. Some had already purchased the book on their own and read it. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion during our reunion about the book, kind of how I wrote it, me explaining, this is not just here's what we did during the jury, right? Kind of explaining the concept behind the book
Right.
and explaining to them, because one thing that can be a little nerve-wracking, it happened with this book, it happened with the book I wrote for my two high school children, is you're taking people who exist and you're kind of writing them true to their character, what you want to be true to their character. And for me, there's always this risk that I get it wrong, and the person reading it says, "Wait, that's what you think about me? I'm not that way at all." Right? I was very
Yes.
nervous for my daughter's book, Ghoul, because it was the first time doing that, and I didn't want her friends, or more importantly, I didn't want her parents reading it thinking, "Oh, this is what you think of my child," right? Thankfully, that hasn't happened, but it's still there. And so I told,
Mhm.
all the jury members, I said, "Look, I kind of picked one personality trait that I remembered from each one of you, and kind of use that and blew up your character based on that." Right? So,
Right.
the characters aren't heavily nuanced. They pretty much revolve around one or two character traits that were evident to me during the trial. And so far, nobody's yelled at me, so I'm okay.
During the writing process, you didn't do a recce on their characters or their being by talking to them or interacting with them. It was a 1 year later surprise
Um,
kind of thing for them.
no, we'd actually have a group text going together.
Okay. Okay.
And while we have never actually seen each other since then, you know, it seemed like once a month, something would flare up in the
Okay.
group text and we'd sit and talk about things. Or I'd send separate texts to certain characters saying, I just need to know what your house looks like. I'm not going to give the address, but I
Uh-huh.
just need a description of your house, right? Or what would you say is a good last name for you? So I was speaking
Sure.
with them on the side, and one of the jury members actually was very, very um, instrumental from a fact checking standpoint, right? She had excellent memory. She took the most notes
Okay.
of anybody in the jury,
Okay.
and that's actually noted throughout the book. And so she was very instrumental in helping me not only fact check, but read through the book and say, does it make sense, right? Not only
Sure.
am I getting things right that, we went through, but its actual book makes sense. And so I owe her a debt of gratitude because she was very helpful.
Yep. God bless those friends and
Yeah.
folks who help with the editing process before the editors get to it.
Yeah. And as a jury, we've already made plans to say, okay, we're going to get together as a group again over the summer
Right.
and do some
Right.
other event. Because one thing I told them, I said, all right, we always know each other, we count each other as friends, but now we need to move it out of the jury. Right? We can't sit and talk about the trial,
Right.
the next time we get together, because we've already beat that one to death. Now we need to take our
There- there-
relationships and move them to the next level. If we're really going to be friends, we
Sure.
start doing friend type things. So
Right. Right.
see how that
So did
shakes
you
out.
by any chance meet for breakfast?
We did not meet for breakfast. They came. I mean, the breakfast jury title has a couple of allegories to it. One was because it rides on the Breakfast Club takes those themes. But the
Right.
other is because bringing breakfast became a thing for us. Like
Uh,
every morning, someone's like, all right, I got breakfast tomorrow. And they would go to some local
yeah.
pastry or breakfast shop that they knew about that they liked and would bring stuff from there. So we very much
Nice.
revolved around our breakfast food in terms of kick off our
Uh,
days. But no, we did
Very
not meet for
interesting.
breakfast. We met in the afternoon. Someone said, I don't know if I want to show up for our reunion. I'll probably just bring my own drinks.
Uh, yeah, I'm excited. What's been the most memorable experience that you've had as a writer? And whether it is about sharing your work or whether it's in the process of writing it, and probably the most interesting reaction to your work so far.
So, I mean, as a writer, a lot of things become interesting because every day is really the fuel for your ideas. And so there are probably a dozen different incidents I could cite, but I'm going to stick with one. And this happened very early on. My
Okay.
first book, my second book, the first adult thriller, Killing the Man. It was reviewed by, one of these, I guess, what do you call them, volunteer review services. So in other words, you ask them,
Yes.
my book has just been published, would you review it and, post the review on Amazon, send me the review so I can use that as part of my marketing material.
Right.
And there are a lot of services like that around here. And so I sent it, and I still remember this review where, it's a pretty in-depth review. They read the entire book, obviously. And he's like, I didn't like the main character. I thought he acted like a man-child. I could not align with him. I could not understand why he did what he did. Blah, blah, blah. He's just talking about, it made it hard for me to read. And then as the review wraps up, but in the end, it turned out to be a very good story. And he gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And that struck
Wow.
me because I'm like, okay, this is a guy who can't stand the main character that I wrote in my book. Even despite that, he comes around and says, but, the guy kind of changed, he grew up, and it ended up being a very good book in the end. So,
Right. Right.
to me, that was kind of a surprise that I was able to essentially win over a reader from page 1 through page 400 or whatever it ends at, that at the end, he's like, wow, it actually ended up being a good book, even though I can't stand this guy. So that was
Very, very interesting.
very life-changing for me.
So I think all the books with the bookmark halfway through them, they still have hope.
They might have hope, right? I might be a little tougher audience on that one. But yes, there is hope.
Any parting words for the readers, budding writers that you want to conclude the
Um,
session with?
I would say for budding writers, right? We get questions quite a bit, right? What tools do you use? What references do you have, right? What books do you read to make your writing better? And I think probably the one thing I would say, having done 9 of these now, is that, the references only get you so far. The reference novels, the how-to, right? How to write for dummies type books only get you so far. The only way out is through. And by that, I mean,
Yeah,
if you want to get better at writing, you have to write, right? You're not going to get better at writing by reading a bunch of books and then sitting down in front of a blank page. So you have to write your way through it. The only way out is through. And another more tactical piece of advice I think goes along with that is, find whose writing you really admire. Right? For me, Nelson DeMille. I said, what about Nelson DeMille's writing did I like? Why did I think that was my most natural style? And you do that and kind of find out what elements of their writing really resonates with you, and kind of use that as your baseline to say, okay, this is going to be my style of writing to start with, because it feels the best to me, is the one I like the best, and that helps you on that path of getting out by going through. So that would be
sure.
my best advice.
I hope that the phrase "the only way is through" stays with some of them, and they actually see it through. And
Yep.
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, right? Everybody wants to write. So
That's all from my side, Ken. It's been really, really amazing. I think we've been in conversation for almost an hour, and I think I could go on for another hour, just picking your brain about everything and asking all sorts of questions. But
you
maybe
don't want
we'll
to get
have to
my
leave that
verbal
for another
cannon.
time.
Yeah, you don't want me to get my verbal cannon warmed up, because we'll be here for a while. So thank you very much for having me, Puneet. I appreciate this.
This has been truly joyous for us, and thank you for making our evening. And I wish you a very, very happy book touring, marketing, and selling experience. I wish this becomes a bestseller, and Yep. Hope to connect with you again someday, and I'll keep checking out the podcast episodes.
All right. Thank you very much. You take care of yourself.
Thank you. Bye bye. Good
All right.
night.
Bye.
Good day.